While the U.S. 1st and 2nd Divisions were locked in battle at Soissons, the Germans were also being pressed on other fronts. General Foch's constant refrain was "Attaquez! Attaquez!" With the arrival of the Americans, he was able to fulfill this aggressiveness. 2 U.S. divisions, 4th and 26th, were already attacking the side of the Marne salient to the south, the 26th at Below Wood, the 4th west of the main highway from Soissons to Château-Thierry, its battalions mixed in with French units. Both had jumped off July 18 after a short artillery barrage. 3 days later the U.S. 3rd Division attacked across the Marne River over floating footbridges and began moving against the hills to the north. The divisions were a mixed bag. The 4th was a regular army division that was regular in name only. Filled out with draftees and rookies, the men of one of its regiments arrived near the front having yet to fire their rifles. The men of the division's field signal battalion arrived in France with holsters, but no pistols. They stuffed their empty holsters with scrap paper to give the illusion of weaponry. That lack had been largely remedied by July 18, but the Ivies, as they were called after their ivy leaf divisional insignia, had never seen combat, not even a quiet tour of the trenches, since arriving in France in May. They were an unknown quantity. The 26th Division had more experience, but even the New England Guardsmen making up the division had never faced machine guns in open maneuver. Similarly, the 3rd Division, fresh from its magnificent stand on the Marne on July 15, had no other combat experience to speak of. All 3 divisions would learn many hard lessons in the days ahead. Their teachers would be the boys in the Feldgrau uniforms and coal-scuttle helmets. This was our boys' first fighting against machine guns, and at the beginning they had many losses because they would insist on charging the guns frontally. The French never did this. If they were held up, they telephoned back for artillery and sat down until the big guns had reduced the nests. One of our boys in the 103rd, a Greek, undertook to charge a machine gun all alone, out in the open. Of course, the gun was turned on him and the stream of bullets practically cut him in two at the waist. The German machine gunners would fire on our men, as they came, till the last moment. Then they would throw up their hand and cry, "Kamerad." It was astonishing that boys who had gone through the spray of death could restrain themselves even when they were ordered. They had seen their comrades drop all the way up, one by one. Heaven only knows how they could keep from eliminating the Germans, even when they surrendered. As a matter of fact, there were fewer prisoners than might have been expected. The Germans had placed a long line of machine guns at the bottom of the very gradual slope. These were completely hidden by the tall wheat. Not an enemy could be seen. The Americans were permitted to come halfway down the slope, then machine guns opened at a preconcerted signal. They fired low, shooting through the wheat. The defeat was terrible. Hardly a soldier was hit in the head. Nearly all the dead had chest or abdominal wounds. The Yankees pushed the attack on July 22. No sooner had the men started to move forward, bayonets fixed, than the deadly chatter of a dozen enemy machine guns began anew and the ripe heads of wheat spouted like fountains in the air. The new men became demoralized by the withering fire and constantly sought cover without orders. This checked the rush of the advance, and it became necessary for squad leaders to drive their men forward, in some cases by force. Greenhorns in the rear tried to fire through the ranks ahead and increased the casualties. It developed that morning that the last batch of replacements sent up could not even load a rifle, much less fire it. These men had been sent to the 2 companies, B and D, in the woods just before the great advance and had only landed in France on July 4. When our company finally cleared the wheat field, it was only to be pinned down at the edge of a strip of woods. A road ran along just there, and the Germans had it covered with machine gun fire. A group of our men led by a lieutenant, the last of our company officers, tried to cross the road. The lieutenant fell. The rest of the men dived back beside the road. A sniper's bullet had got the lieutenant and the machine guns then opened up. Mike and I were trying to drag the lieutenant back to cover in the ditch. Several men ran out to help us. The machine gun bullets began to spray around us. We gave it up and made for the ditch again. We found one of our sergeants commanding what was left of the company. The sergeant completely lost his head. He sent a detail out to bring the lieutenant in. They were all hit before they got to him. And the fire they drew resulted in the lieutenant's being shot again, in the leg. The sergeant ordered me to form another detail, go out in close formation and come back with the lieutenant. I asked the sergeant to wait a little, then let me take Mike and go out alone. We'll get him in our own way, I said. There's no use eliminated any more soldiers by sending them out there now. The sergeant calmed down at that and let us have our way about it. When we figured that the Germans had had time enough to shift their attention from the road, Mike and I wormed our way out and got back into the ditch with the lieutenant. There wasn't much shelter there anymore, but we had nowhere else to leave him while we went on. The bullet had hit the left side of his head and come out in the middle of his forehead. His brain was lying out there on his forehead, but he was alive and he could talk. He was still alive when they found him there that night and took him back to the dressing station. I never knew what became of him afterward. Sergeant Craig, a big husky fighting man, came through with an odd experience. A Boche dropped a potato masher grenade and ran for it. He ducked into a dugout and Craig picked up the grenade and pulled the string. "Come out, Boche," he yelled at the man in the pit and flung his missile at the same moment. The German popped his head out just in time to catch the grenade squarely on the forehead. Orders for a gradual withdrawal from the Marne salient had been issued by the German High Command the night of July 18. The retirement began the night of July 19 to 20. Withdrawal was conducted in successive stages as the Germans attempted to save what they could of the huge quantities of supplies and ammunition in the salient. Behind them they left a screen of machine guns and delaying parties. The professionalism of those efforts could be measured in the casualties of the U.S. divisions. By July 23, the 26th Division had suffered serious casualties, approximately 4,000 men, and all four of its infantry regiments were so thoroughly intermingled they had nearly lost their identity. I saw rows of wounded boys on stretchers just brought in. Those rows were 4 deep and extended several hundred yards. In all of these places I probably saw 1,000 or more of our American soldiers with every conceivable kind of wound, some with legs or arms blown away, some with eyes shot out, many with chins gone, others with every muscle in their bodies shaking as with palsy, shell-shocked, some with bodies burned by gas so badly that they were black. We laid to rest our passed away in little groups of 3 to 15, with just a blanket or a shelter half wrapped around them. The prisoners we had knew where some of our boys lay passed away, and they were marched back under guard to these spots and made to bring back our passed away on litters for burial. Some of the bodies were beginning to discolor, and the stench was almost unbearable. The body of Lieutenant Hugh Blanchard was brought in. For some reason his chest had expanded, and when I stuck my 2 fingers through the upper part of his blouse to retrieve one of his dog tags, my fingers broke a big blister and made a noise like when one punctures a balloon. That really scared me and I started running nowhere. Chaplain de Valles, who was officiated at these burials, called me back and assured me that the man was not coming back to life. Rudely constructed crosses were made and set up on the resting places, and their names written on them. In some cases a rifle was stuck at the head of the grave with the Yanks helmet on it, and his name on the chin strap. Each soldier was laid to rest with one dog tag around his neck for future identification. Some were laid to rest unknown. These resting places were carefully recorded by the chaplain. All personal effects were removed from the passed away and wrapped separately, and each package had a dog tag tied securely to it and sent to the grave's registration department, who in turn forwarded the effects to the next of kin. Sometimes we found something pleasant to remember. One German prisoner came into division headquarters wearing a tag in his buttonhole. The tag read, "This man when captured was giving water to a wounded American soldier." And 3 other German Red Cross men were actually bandaging up wounded Yankees on the field when they were taken. As the Germans fell back, American troops poured into the vacuum, the 28th, the 32nd, and the 42nd Divisions, along with artillery and support units. There were many fine houses in Essems, and I went into several near our courtyard. The German soldiers had evidently urinated against the wallpaper in a good many places, and I saw feces in most of the rooms. Brocaded curtains, lace, and silk dresses were the favorite substitutes for toilet paper. In the business section of Château Thierry, all the shop windows were broken and the shops looted. Here the Germans had found more scope for their originality. I noticed a derby hat full of feces and, in a shoe store, a pair of ladies' dancing slippers full of urine. Many of the places had been burned, but not all. Essems had been badly looted by the Boche, and one of the curious impressions made by the place upon a visitor was the clouds of feathers drifting about streets and dwellings. Either in a spirit of destruction or more probably in the search for money which he thought might be concealed in them, the German appeared to have slit open every feather bed, pillow or feather quilt in the town, and their contents eddied about in every breeze. As we went along, we came to many passed-away Germans. Some had been pulled off the road. At one place we saw many of them lined up for laid to rest. They smelled quite passed away, but the French driver of the truck insisted on stopping to look them over. Boche, mort, bon, he said over and over. I would translate this as, passed away Boche, or German, is a good German. French soldiers standing alongside the road held their noses and laughed and said, tomorrow. They weren't in a hurry to put their enemies underground. Sanitary crews and engineers were cleaning up as fast as they could, but a bit farther on we started to pass fallen heroes, Germans, still lying upon the road. I saw German soldiers sitting beside the road quite passed away. Their arms and heads were bandaged. They had had a bit of attention, but had fell anyway. My French driver had a hatred for the Germans and a strong stomach, too, for he ran over every passed-away German he could reach with his truck. He zigzagged along from passed-away German to passed-away German, driving his huge truck over them and smashing them as completely as the rabbits and skunks we see eliminated along our own roads so often. Then he would stop and look at them and laugh. About 100 yards downstream of the Marne, one of our men and a poilu were fishing by throwing hand grenades into the Marne. The wisdom of eating fish at this time was doubtful. The river must have been full of passed-away Germans, and the conclusion, at least for me, was obvious. We were issued beef in immense quantities, sometimes having to lay to rest a whole quarter of it. It became tainted very easily, where of course there was no possible means of refrigeration. This meat ration came wrapped in burlap, generally reasonably fresh. But once open, it had to be carried around in the ration carts, and unless quickly cooked, it spoiled very rapidly, especially in those hot summer days along the Marne when the sun was hot. Another thing which hastened the destruction of perishable food was the immense amount of decay all along the front. All those rotten woods were filled with passed-away horses, passed-away men, the refuse, excrement and the garbage of armies. The ground must have been literally alive with pus and decay germs. Scratch your hand, cut yourself in shaving, or get a little abrasion on your foot, and almost anything could happen. Horses are huge when they become bloated, swell to twice their normal size. Their legs are thrust out like steel posts, and it requires a hole about 10 feet square and 6 feet deep to put a horse under. If the legs were off, a hole hardly more than half that size is required. At times we succeeded in using an axe and saw to cut off the horse's legs. It was a hard task and unpleasant, but it had to be done. Here we again ran across some of the 26th U.S. Division. At that time they had seen so much more fighting than we, that they seemed veterans by comparison. Their clothes were in very bad shape, the set expression of their faces, and their small platoons advertised what they had been through. They sat along the roads and told us stories of the fights and recounted details of their losses. I thought it disheartening for our men, but the Yanks did not seem to feel that way about it. They held an absolutely fatalistic viewpoint, telling us we would never get through the game. Wait, they said, wait. Later on I understood. There was a great pride about these fellows. I thought I would take a little walk with some of the fellows to see whether we could gather in some souvenirs. We walked from the back of our dugout across a little field and into a piece of woods. There must have been very heavy fighting along here, as I noticed shell holes all through the field. We had gone a short distance into the woods when we noticed a place where the Germans had had a battery of artillery. Judging by the destruction, one of our 6-inch shells must have hit in the midst of it. I counted 12 Germans scattered in through there who had evidently been neutralized 2 or 3 days before. Some of them were whole and some were pretty well cut up. While we were standing looking at this awful sight, a fellow from the 26th Division came up and seeing a ring on the hand of one of the Germans, he took out his knife and cut off the finger, keeping the ring for a souvenir. It made shivers run up and down my back. I don't think I will ever be cold-blooded enough to do a thing like that. The boys were forever dressing up in things they found in deserted villages. In practically every French home there was a silk hat, and these were the Doughboys' delight. They were always of ancient vintage and quaint shape. Practically every company had at least one joker with a battered old tile on his head, and many a mule was conducted down the endless columns of traffic by solemn, silk-hatted, khaki-shirt, muddy-shod drivers. One man, Happy Carabash of Webster, belonging in Company M of the 104th Infantry, went over the top into Belleau carrying an umbrella he had found, and his rifle. He hadn't any more pack than a jackrabbit, but he had found the umbrella in a farm, and it was raining, so he carried it. The wonder is that the umbrella didn't make him so conspicuous a target as to get him neutralized. A medical unit had established a dressing station in a barn. The wounded lay along the road in rows, some sitting, and many blood-soaked and unattended. Some were in a frightfully nervous state, shrieking when a battery of 75s fired, which it did every few minutes. The guns were set right out in the fields and along the road, with their trail pieces newly dug in. The noise was terrific, making us stagger as we passed. It was like being close to a blast when it unexpectedly goes off. They were shelling a wood directly opposite us, so the pieces were laid almost level. Even in daylight there was a blinding glare like taking a flashlight photograph, then a blow of sound and air followed as if one were being shoved by a drunken man. Backed into the ditch near one battery was a Ford ambulance which had been struck by shrapnel. The driver had been neutralized. He was sitting with his head resting on the wheel, his hands hanging down, dripping blood. A wounded man on the upper row of stretchers was also passed away. We could look in as we passed. The stiff angle of the feet was characteristic, and the dark purple stains of the blood on his khaki showed he had been passed away some time. Old blood stains look as though someone had wiped his hands on brown clothes after picking elderberries, dark and purple. While I was loafing about the entrance of our dugout I noticed that there was quite a lot of excitement along the road and I looked down and saw about 200 Boche prisoners. This is the first time I have seen such a number and they surely are a pretty sad-looking bunch of soldiers. I suppose our men would look just as badly if they were taken prisoners. These fellows wore dirty and torn uniforms, but their physical condition seemed very good. They were not half-starved as the usual wild rumors had reported. Some of our fellows ran down and tore the buttons and shoulder straps from their uniforms, and even went so far as to take their hats as souvenirs. We are certainly a great gang for collecting souvenirs. The Boche prisoners certainly looked dumb and offered no resistance. In fact, some of them tore their buttons off and handed them to our boys. I guess they were afraid they were going to be neutralized. By July 25 the German withdrawal was 16 kilometers from Château Thierry, the old high-water mark, but the retreat was no rout. The enemy was merely retreating to yet another defense line, this one along the heights of the Ourcq River, more of a creek by American standards, where they stopped to confront the U.S. 42nd, Rainbow, Division. The Rainbows came in for the 26th and 28th Divisions the night of July 25. The 32nd Division came in for the U.S. 3rd Division on July 29. On Sunday morning, July 28, the 42nd Division Doughboys rose from their bivouacs south of the Ourcq and started forward to drive the Germans from the heights to the north of the stream. Moments later the Maxim machine guns began their chug-chugging and rainbow blood began to flow. Whoever first thought of using barbed wire as a battlefield impediment could have given lessons in pragmatism. It certainly works. It is a dreadful handicap and makes quick progress impossible. The German engineers made a practice of stringing a tight wire under the grass in front of the fence, wherever the grass was thick enough to hide it. Men tripped over the wire and plunged headlong into the entanglement behind it. Most of the wiring I saw was but knee-high, but members of the Rainbow Division told me that they had met much higher wiring in some of their fights. A favorite form consisted of 3 fences, with intervals of 7 or 8 feet, 2 or 3 wires to each fence, some slack, some tight, and cross wires running irregularly hither and thither, backward and forward over the post tops, and a few loose wires on the ground. Generally, wires were alternately drawn tight and left slack, and men floundering through this mess, while it clutched and hampered them, made easy targets for German snipers to shoot at leisure. Men plunged to earth to the right and left of me. Almost at every stride some comrade fell, stumbling forward lifeless, or falling to catch his wind and rock for a while through the first disordering sting of a fatal wound. Others just slipped down and lay low and still, too badly wounded and spent to go on with the advance. I saw these incidents, little nightmare incidents, flashed upon the screen of my vision in jumbled, jerky fashion, and I ran on feeling that the whole thing was just a dream, stopping to aim and fire as some chance gray uniform showed, and then blindly running on. I was winded, so were we all, but on such a field and at such a time one never seems to notice things like that. The mind is detached from the work of the field and the actions of the body are automatic, going on and on. It is a good thing, when the fight goes warm, that one can't think too much. The damaging fire was coming from our left and right, the source completely invisible but yet a sheaf of bullets through the young wheat. A man crouches to run forward. He is shot through the legs, drops to hands and knees, is hit in the legs and arm, down flat and is again hit in the head. A bullet cuts my coat on the back of my shoulder but barely scratches. The men of my headquarters group are all neutralized but one, a terrible feeling of helplessness because there seems no one to fight against and it is the officer's responsibility to pick the targets and reduce the enemy fire by your own. 180 degrees of emptiness. We fired on every possible bit of cover but it seemed pretty futile, there were so many. As our company advanced over the Ourcq we were held up on the crest of Hill 212.1 was ordered by my captain, Everett Jackson, to go out with my squad on the left flank of Company F to protect a machine gun detachment of 2 guns. We met a very stubborn fire from the enemy. The machine gunners were all neutralized. George Schwend and myself were the only 2 left. A very heavy patrol of the enemy was trying to get around our left to cut off Company E and also to get us caught in an enfilade fire. Neither Schwend nor myself knew anything about a machine gun, but we happened to pull the right trigger. I am happy to say we drove back the heavy patrol of the enemy and saved Company F from being wiped out. About this time a young chap of Company F lay badly wounded about 10 yards from me. As I looked at him he was pleading for a drink of water. I could not stand the pitiful look in his eyes. I did not have a canteen of water with me, but I noted that just beyond me lay a passed-away American soldier with a canteen on his side. I told Schwend that I was going to get that canteen for the passed-away boy. He told me I was crazy, that a sniper would surely get me, but I did not stop. I got the canteen from the passed-away soldier and luckily it was filled with water. I came back to this chap and as I held up his head and gave him a drink, he clasped my hand and said, "Corporal, you're a regular guy." He fell a few minutes later, but with a passed-away buddy looking up and saying, "You're a regular guy," I felt at that time that it was worth getting shot for. Just a few minutes later I was shot through the right leg. The bones were shattered, so I was helpless to move. George Schwend, seeing this, carried me about a half-mile in his arms under heavy fire. We had at least 3 or 4 narrow escapes from shells and machine guns, but my buddy George Schwend would not leave me, though I begged him to go on and that I might be able to crawl to our line. He carried me to safety with no thought to his personal safety, and I am happy to say we both returned to our home state of Alabama after the war. We remained in position, past Croix Rouge Farm, for over 3 hours, expecting the rest of the army to arrive. I finally ordered the machine gun dismounted. Paul, the gunner, took the gun from the tripod. Harry Martinson, the loader, reached to take the traversing head from the tripod when he was hit by an explosive bullet. Paul slit his blouse and belt right through to the wound in the center of the back. Paul used his own first aid kit. He put the dressing right into the wound, just as it was. Martinson remained for an hour and, like others, was crying out in pain. The only place of concealment was where we jumped off, about 500 yards from the Ourcq. I picked up Martinson and started to carry him back. He was apologizing for all the trouble that he was causing. We had only walked about 50 feet when I saw that he did not have his helmet on. I was carrying him on his side, trying to ease his pain. We reached a point about 100 yards from the Ourcq when Harry was hit again in the back, by a sniper. His stomach pushed against mine, he gasped and passed away. Fighting for the heights to the north of the Ourcq continued over the next 4 days. Villages such as Cergy, Sierges, places like Croix Rouge Farm and the Ourcq itself became names survivors would one day utter with a pride touched with horror. Cergy before the war was an unpretentious village in the valley of the Ourcq. The river itself is only a few feet wide and in places can be easily taken at a leap. Many American officers, when they first crossed it, reported that they had passed a creek, but were unable to find the river. We joked with the French liaison officer Rirat about the size of the French rivers. I told him that one of our soldiers, Jack Finnegan, lay badly wounded near the Ourcq River, and I offered him a pull at my canteen. Raising himself on one elbow and throwing out his arm in a Sir Philip Sidney fashion, he exclaimed, "Give it to the Ourcq, it needs it more than I do." Although a great story, it has a sad ending. Like many of our grand boys, Jack fell of his wound. The roads were strewn with our doughboys, gray faces in the mud, blue hands frozen to their guns. Near the Ourcq, a 16-inch shell had blown a German from his resting places for the 3rd time. His face bore such real resentment that some doughboy wrote a sign and hung it on his chest, "For the love of God, leave me alone. I got appendicitis." In the poppy fields the living lay with the passed away, it was hard to tell which was which. The moral courage which accompanied the physical courage of the Americans in Europe was grimly demonstrated during the worst of the congestion in one of the Chateau Thierry hospitals by a wizened Alabama doughboy. The tattered remnant of the body of Bishop M. Lee, bearing several severe trunk wounds and -1 leg, was delivered to the hospital by an ambulance. His case was hopeless and he knew it. He confided his passed-away words to the wardmaster and asked for paper and pencil to write to his mother. The letter was started but never finished. When the paper was taken from his passed-away grip, it read, "Dear Mother, I have been slightly wounded and am in the hospital. It was just a scratch, so don't worry." Shot down by a spray of bullets just as he reached his platoon commander with a message, "Private Martin A. Treptow of Company M left behind him another message that was as effective against the enemy as a score of machine guns." In a little blood-stained book found in his breast pocket, he had painstakingly copied, "America shall win the war. Therefore I will work, I will save, I will sacrifice, I will endure, I will fight cheerfully and do my utmost, as if the whole issue of the struggle depended on me alone." An officer from the supply company was on the road to the regimental PC. One day when he met a violent soldier slowly making his way toward a dressing station. He was gripping his abdomen with both hands. "What's the hurt, buddy, can I help?" he called out. "I'm shot through here, sir," the man replied. "If I take my hands away, everything will fall out. I haven't far to go now, I'll make it." The PC was crowded with men who had come from the field. Into it stumbled a man from Company A, so cruelly wounded that it took courage to face him. He had been shot in the face. Unable to talk, for a bullet had clipped off part of his tongue, with an ear hanging by a shred, cheek laid open, blood dripping over his shirt and dyeing his hands crimson. He yet listened intently as he was given directions to the dressing station. Accompanied by another who had only lost a finger, he started back, one of the many walking cases. There were no stretcher-bearers up this far. They had their hands full with the men who had already struggled back part of the way to the aid station. There was an almost continuous line of maimed men walking, crawling, staggering along the road back of Hill 212. The aid stations were, of course, choked, and, like every other spot in the vicinity, were being heavily shelled. Lieutenant Farrell D. Miner, of Beaumont, Texas, an officer of Company K but attached to Company I in the Croix Rouge farm fight, was shot through the head. It was thought to be a hopeless case, but the officer lived 2 months after receiving the wound. When he was being carried back in an ambulance, it appeared that he wanted to say something. He would raise his head now and then and count, 1, 2, 3, 4. We went through the town of Beauvarts, and it was a sight, nothing but passed away and destruction. Some of the cannoneers even had to come and clean the road for the pieces to get through. Most of the buildings were still burning, buildings were caving in and explosions could be heard throughout the town. All of the passed away Americans had been taken away, but German passed away were still lying about the street, some of them hanging out of windows, some of them with their feet upon the sidewalks and their heads in the gutters, others welled up so that their clothes were simply cutting them through, and black and blue, all over from the effects of the gas. Helmets were still on their heads, in fact they dropped there with everything they owned, and the stench was so sickening that some of the boys got sick. We went back into the woods which we ourselves took over a week ago, awaiting someone else to relieve us from this support position. As we came in the night of our last relief, a wagon train made for the grounds of the, nearby, chateau. It was dark, wet and disagreeable. A major general named Cameron, who had just arrived and taken possession, ordered the train away. An Irishman named Gilhooly, who did not know that this man was a general who was talking, and perhaps would not have cared if he did know, said, "This is a hell of a note, we go and capture this place and you guys come and live in it." The general rated him roundly and said there were too damn many flies around there now without bringing a lot of animals in the yard, and Gilhooly answered, "Flies, is it? If it is flies you want, go up on the hillside and you will see thousands of them feasting on the blood of our men." The general said nothing more. The train stayed in the chateau yard that night. On July 31 the Wisconsin and Michigan Guardsmen of the 32nd Division came in on the 42 ND Division's right with orders to attack toward Sierges. On approaching Beauvarts, the first American passed away soldier was passed. He was on a litter and fell while being carried to the field hospital. A little farther on, the passed away body of a doughboy was lying in the gutter, his head having been blown off by a shell. The 42nd Division had fought through these woods and the American and German passed away had not yet been laid to rest. Some ghastly sights met our eyes. One American doughboy was neutralized while firing his rifle from a kneeling position. His head was split in two, one half remaining erect and the other falling on his raised arm, while the body remained in its former kneeling position. Glancing about the plain as one walked across it, small knobs would be apparent here and there. A closer inspection would identify each as the rounded top of an American helmet, and on carefully studying the object one could discern under the rim the thin features and staring eyes of the occupant of the burrow. Most men when digging would go straight down for a distance of about 3 feet, excavating a pit just large enough for the owner to kneel or crouch entirely below the surface. From time to time a roaring blast of shrapnel or glancing machine gun fire would sweep by like a hurricane. Then the knobs would disappear, sinking softly down under the level of the earth. After a minute, here and there they would begin cautiously to rise again, and in another moment the dusty surface of the plain would once more be dotted by helmets and peering faces. The 121st put their kitchen in a hole in which they thought the enemy could not hit it, but nonetheless they calculated wrongly, for the Germans dropped a shell squarely into the hollow. Quite a number of men were near. One started to run. The explosion lifted him from the earth, hurling him forward like a sack of meal for 12 or 15 feet. He fell on his face in the mud and, raising himself up on his hands, tried to crawl along. He actually did move 2 or 3 feet, with his face turned up toward the sky and his legs trailing helplessly, for he was mangled almost beyond recognition. He threw back his head and screamed, as he struggled along, leaving a red trail in the mud. His agony seemed to last hours, though it was not more than 2 or 3 seconds till he sank down on his face and fell. A second man standing in front of me fell over, passed away with a piece of the shell in his heart. He was lucky and fell quickly. A third nearby was terribly torn, his chest shattered so that one could see his heart beating, and he, too, fell in a few moments. The others were less seriously hurt and survived. That first shell was a shock, to say the least. That first shell was a shock, to say the least. We were in Bellevue Farm when Captain Harry Williams, the regimental personnel adjutant, hurried into the room in some excitement and explained, "That soldier lying on the trench out there where all those Boches are floating around in the water is Otto Haugen. His brother, Mother, Haugen, is on the way here now with the headquarters company. We ought to take care of the remains before he arrives." This was a tough situation, and yet what could we do? Everyone in the group knew Mother, Haugen, the first sergeant of headquarters company. Some of us had known him for years, for he was one of the old-timers in the Wisconsin National Guard. Many of us knew that the Haugen family of Nelsville had contributed 4 sons to the service. Otto out there in the rain was the next to the youngest and had been a private first class. Now he lay upon the fresh earth at the edge of the German trenches while below a half-dozen sodden figures floated in the dirty yellow water that half filled it. It was not long before the headquarters company did arrive and some comrade told Haugen the sorrowful news. When the chaplain came up, he found Haugen dejected and alone, and after the long silent handclasp that says so much at times, finally said, "Well, Haugen, we can't leave the boy this way, let's do what we can for him now." To take his mind off of the difficult work of the recovery squads, they sent Haugen to find a blanket in which to wrap the remains. After a long search, he returned, unable to find one. As he talked with the chaplain, Captain Thomas Watson of Fond du Lac, who was standing nearby, overheard the conversation and without a word, took off his own slicker and handed it over, saying, "Here, Sergeant, this will be better than nothing and I can salvage another someplace," and turned to his company in the rain. After the burial, Captain Arnold and our adjutant suggested to Haugen that he take a few days' leave to recover his bearings, but Haugen was a soldier and all his friends and buddies were up there on a rain-swept hill awaiting the word to resume the war. He now had a personal interest in that war, and looking off to the north where pillars of smoke marked the German retreat, declared he would stay with his outfit. The Legion post at Nelsville is named after Otto A. Haugen. Corporal Otto Chadaba was wounded in the arm by a bursting shell when we attacked the Germans at Sierges. It was a painful wound and caused Otto much agony. Buck Kraus, who stood near and helped to dress the wound, said to him, "What in hell are you crying for? You ought to be glad, for now you can go to the hospital and lay between white sheets." Then, pointing to the spot where Frank Novak with his head severely injured was lying, he said, "How would you like to be like him?" While in this position we saw some of the worst cases of shell shock. One individual behaved in most eliminated fashion and could hardly be dragged along by 2 companions who were trying to get him to a field hospital. His face had been partly crushed and blackened by the blast of a close shell explosion, and his expression was disturbing in the extreme. His insane shrieks were only surpassed by frantic and senseless bursts of laughter. The nights were continually disturbed by such incidents, and by the cries of shell-shocked men. Most of those outbursts began with a howling peal of laughter, a laugh to make one's skin creep and his hair rise, and ended in a shuddering wail, frequently followed by tears. The shell-shocked men seemed to laugh and to cry almost interchangeably, and some whose faces were drawn up as if in great merriment had tears running down their cheeks, at the height of the convulsion. These men had become totally insane, and some of them caused no little trouble to their comrades trying to care for them. I heard talk of an examination of German prisoners recently captured. While my colonel was conferring with staff officers, I went outside in a court to see these first prisoners of war. There were 3 or 4 men in the field gray of the German army. Their faces were marked by lines of fatigue. Major Paul B. Clemens, G2, and Lieutenant Niederprum were making the examination. Lieutenant Niederprum, who came from Detroit, spoke German perfectly and questioned the prisoners and interpreted their answers. An effort was made to learn whether the Germans were fighting a delaying action on the hills north of US or intended to stabilize their lines there. "What orders do you have?" asked Niederprum. "Just to stay there," answered the German soldier. "How long were you told to stay there?" The answer was, "We were not told how long, just to stay there." "But suppose 3 times or 5 times as many troops attacked you, would you stay then?" asked the lieutenant. "Yes, we must stay." "But if many of your force were neutralized or wounded, would you still stay?" The soldier spoke slowly and carefully as he replied, "Well, if but 10 remained out of every 100, then it might be excused if they retired." I left the scene with considerable respect for these men who understood a soldier's duty in such stern terms. The reduction of the Marne salient was completed when Allied troops reached the Visceral River in early August. Because the counterattack had achieved its purpose and the Germans clearly intended to hold the Vesel line in force, the general attack on that front was stopped on August 6. However, the fighting was not over. The 4th, 32nd, 28th, and 77th Divisions each took a turn in bitter fighting along the Vesel River in the vicinity of Fismes through the rest of the month and into September. For several days we had been crawling around Fismes, firing from windows, cellars, attics, and from behind the stone wall in the back of the house yards. This got tiresome, and finally the fellow next to me, a candidate by the name of Vaughan, a man who had qualified for an officer's commission through a special course of study and was waiting only for a vacancy to receive it, raised up, laid his gun upon the top of the wall and started to shoot over the wall. This was more comfortable and it was easier to see what was being shot at. I should have known better with my previous battle experience, but I thought, if Vaughan can shoot over the wall, I can, too. Soon we were banging away merrily. But after several shots each, I suddenly saw Vaughan's helmet go sailing down over the slight hill. I looked at him and the entire top of his head was severely damaged. Apparently a dum-dum type of bullet had flattened against his helmet or tin hat and had struck him at eye and ear level. He had been kneeling. His body shifted backward, his head forward, and he fell instantly in front of me. I did not fire over another wall. The sniper had his choice to pick one or the other of us. For some unknown reason, he chose Vaughan. I'm here and he's gone. The company had reached the marketplace at Fismes and were in comparative safety when a well-directed shell seemed to fall almost in their midst. A wall at the side of the square fell over, instantly neutralizing Sergeant George I. Strawbridge and Private Selesky. Corporal William Lutz was severely damaged. His grieving comrades crowded around him, but his only thought seemed to be of the folks at home. "It will be all right," he said. "Don't any of you write home about it, and again, only don't tell my mother." He fell that same night in the field hospital. Everybody is sick this morning, not from gas but from dysentery. It is not the fatal kind, just a miserable condition affecting every man in the area, caused by a mix of factors including flies, unsanitary water, the heat, and poor food. Flies were everywhere, and at mealtimes the food was often covered by them, making eating unpleasant. Dear Mother, we came across 2 fallen American soldiers from the 59th Machine Gun Company. They had been caught in a shell explosion and were severely injured. Some infantrymen started preparing to lay them to rest. They carefully dug a hole and placed the remains in it, trying to show respect despite the difficult conditions. The area was swarming with flies, and the overall conditions were harsh, but the soldiers did their best to handle the situation with care and dignity. The 2 infantry men doing the burying were peculiar-looking fellows and didn't seem to mind the job at all. We found out later that they were a little dopey and had been selected for the job on that account. They made a cross out of 2 branches and put 2 battered helmets on top of the grave with the papers and wallets which they found in the pockets under the helmets to identify them later on. They couldn't find any of the identification tags which we have around our necks. I am wondering if those poor devils will ever be shoveled out of that hole someday and how they will be able to separate them. They must have been buddies and were snuffed out together. One low point in the campaign occurred in the final days of August. 2 weeks earlier, elements of the 28th Division had captured the village of Fismet on the German side of the Vesle River. Dominated by enemy-held high ground, it was not much of a prize. American officers pleaded for permission to withdraw, but French higher command refused. On August 27 the Germans counterattacked and completely overrun the village. Of the approximately 230 doughboys in the village, only about 30 survivors escaped back across the river. One of them was Lieutenant Bab Hoffman. I saw the Germans coming down the street, moving steadily with their heavy boots and large helmets, advancing bent forward with equipment in hand, determined and intense as they moved through the town. Far down the street was the barrier usually occupied by Americans, and the Germans focused their offensive there, unaware that we were positioned in houses farther up the street. I was standing in the small hall of a corner house when a young German soldier entered without seeing me due to the low light. He leaned out of the doorway, preparing to move to another position as part of their usual method of advance. Faced with a sudden decision, I acted quickly to stop him at close range, and he fell immediately. The offensive passed, and although there were only about 50 of them, none returned, as they were caught between the defenders of the barricade and our position and were gradually neutralized as they attempted to move back along the street. The Germans used a captured Company H man as a shield. He came down the street and when he got to our PC he stuck his head in the door saying, "You'd better surrender, the town is full of Germans," and I was just pulling him into the building when a dozen Germans came rushing in right after him. Our boxes of grenades were gone, our Chauchat ammunition long since exhausted, and all we had left were our pistols, and I don't believe even then, realizing we were surrounded, that we would have given up had it not been for the fact that the Germans took us by surprise. Even after we were captured and the Germans were marching us up the hill, one American continued to pick our guard off. I saw a blue spot in one German's temple and he crumpled up, then another man on the other side of me dropped, then I saw a piece of head go by and another German fell, and still another soldier gave a shriek and fell, a crumpling mass on the street. I'd like to meet that game American sniper someday, believe me. What surprised me most were the details that the Germans knew regarding our organization. The German adjutant seemed to know more about the disposition of our own troops than I did. He told me that Colonel Rickards was in command of the 112th and that Colonel Shannon was in charge of the 111th. A German boy who could speak English also told me that he had eaten in my mess line the night before, and to prove it, he told me just what we had for supper and all about it. He had come over in an American uniform and, mingling with the replacements which we had recently received, had secured a good piece of white bread, all the information he could take with him and got safely back. The 28th Division seemed to be having a bad time around FISMs, and all day long officers were coming in on stretchers from the operating room. A Texas major, a great whale of a man, was put in the cot beside me, gloriously drunk with ether. I heard muttering to himself, "The best-looking bunch of Huns I ever seen, them were regular fellows." Then he lifted a red, unshaven face from the pillow to blink at me. "Say," he whispered confidentially, "them pertater smashers is great. I seen 3 men trying to get out of one window to get rid of one of them fellows." A pause while he vomited over the side of the bed, then with a chuckle, "And they done it, too, I was one of 'em." 6 American divisions participated in the fighting from the Marne to the Vesle between July and September 1918, advancing over 20 miles, removing any enemy threat to Paris, freeing important rail nets and proving the American soldier was decisive, but at high cost. The 3rd Division lost 6,570 men, the 26th Division lost 4,644, the 28th Division lost 4,548, the 32nd lost nearly 4,000, the 42nd lost 5,476, and the 77th lost about 4,600, leaving many officers and men reflective. Arriving in France when French soldiers and civilians focused on defensive action, it was natural for them to stress defensive training, and the American soldiers and officers performed as well in such action as the French instructors, but in offensive action, defects in leadership and training became apparent, with early 1918 fighting seeing higher losses than necessary, yet accomplishing their part of the war despite delinquencies, compounded by an ever-present tendency in the chain of command to push troops against enemy machine guns without adequate support, with general and field officers, inexperienced with large formations against a well-armed enemy, employing the same aggressive tactics used in smaller commands in the Philippines and other campaigns. They would not take the word of the officer in the front lines as to the opposing forces and weapons but kept driving troops forward inadequately supported by artillery. Along the Ourcq there were outstanding examples of this sort of thing. Men were constantly driven against machine guns well placed with ample ammunition and with orders to hold the Yankees back. Finally it dawned upon the general officers they were sacrificing their infantry, and when they massed enough artillery to dislodge the machine guns the way was cleared, for had artillery been turned loose on those positions the first day our infantry would have just walked over Hill 212 and the Germans would never have been able to organize along their next line. Despite it all, they had won. There was no doubt about that. Two things I remember about the march to Gomaville as we left the Marne campaign. One was the people in the towns through which we passed near sunset, who thronged the roadside at the first sound of our wheels and swarmed about as the head of the column rolled into the village street, laughing, crying, holding babies up to touch our hands and giving us flowers from the fields, which we put in our helmet straps. For the people in this region had gotten the idea that we were their preservers who had stopped the German advance from reaching their homes. The other thing I remember was Jack Hart, the saddler, drunk as a lord, and myself herding him along a moonlit road about a mile behind the column, as he would run zigzag until he got well ahead of me and fell into a ditch from which I would pull him and start him on another run, and I finally got him to Gomaville, where he spent the rest of the night digging a latrine.